Welcome to a stuffed-nose edition of Blogging Heads, where both Ross and Douthat and I am recovering from colds, which will make it, I think, a real pleasant listening experience for you, the viewer. Hey, Ross, how you doing?
Good. I'm fine, Ezra. How are you?
Stuffed-nose.
Well, I think you're actually further on the way through your cold than I am, which means that you'll probably be able to run circles around me in our
No, I have the advantage. I've tilted the playing field. I actually, this is really biological warfare on my part.
That's true, actually. No, we did. We saw each other a few days ago, and immediately afterwards I fell into sickness. So
you shouldn't have taken that blanket.
Preemption works after all, or something.
Yeah, you should have taken the blanket.
I should have, yeah. I guess we'll start out today talking about a piece that I wrote in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly, if that's okay.
Sure.
A little bit of self-promotion.
That's why we're here, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're here to educate the American public about the great issues of the day. But yes, also
at least the ones bearing our bylines.
That's right. So in the spirit of that, so I have a piece in this month's Atlantic about the future of the Republican Party, and particularly the future of Bush Republicanism, which I suggest is defined by the combination of moralistic interventionism abroad, big government and deficit spending at home, and social conservatism. And it's defined by its rejection of the realist and isolationist strains in Republican foreign policy, by its rejection of sort of Christine Todd Whitman-style social liberalism, and by its rejection of hardline small government conservatism. And in the aftermath of the 2006 electoral defeat for the Republicans, there's been a lot of talk about how, Bush Republicanism is finished. You're going to go have James Baker coming back in foreign policy to return them to realism. You're going to have a return to small government principles from the Congress. And, maybe you're even going to see an abandonment of social conservatism or attempt to, moderate it to some degree. And my piece basically argues that that's not in fact the case, and that particularly if you look at how the different Republican candidates are positioning themselves in 2008, the Republican Party for the next 4 to 8 years is probably going to look a lot more like the party of Bush than a lot of people expect right now.
Sure. I mean, I think that because the Bush administration kept the enemies you would expect, because Howard Dean or Dick Gephardt or Tom Daschle or Ted Kennedy were always arrayed against them, people have tended to dismiss the magnitude of the break that they actually represent with traditional republicanism in, as you quite correctly say, every format. On foreign policy, they've been remarkably adventurous and imperialistic abroad in a way that really wasn't. Even Bush's father, and as you say, James Baker, was identified with a very conscious rejection of this sort of belief in American expansionary power. Back in the Bush 1 memoirs co-written with Baker, they talk about exactly why they didn't go into Iraq, for exactly the reasons it turns out we shouldn't have, or why they didn't stay there and try to overthrow Saddam, which turns out to be exactly why we probably shouldn't have done it as well. And I don't think, it was a weird thing with the Iraq study group, which came out, and the punditocracy en masse agreed that Bush would have to live by its dictates, was probably even looking forward to doing so. Michael Duffy wrote a cover piece for Time about why Bush will listen to his father and his father's buddies. And not only didn't he, but he consciously took it as an opportunity to reject their advice. He didn't just, listen to it, say these are a bunch of good ideas, and then not really implement them. He listened to it, convened a panel of experts who hate them, and did exactly what they said not to do, which was further commit, not engage Syria and Iran. On every level, he has thrown their ideas out the window. This is a real, this crew is not joking around. They're not accidentally doing everything they're doing. It's a real philosophical shift. And, it's one that because of the sort of tribal nature of American politics, and because we're in a sort of changed environment from the Soviet Union era when small government conservatism and things like that made a bit more sense, it's one that can endure. They're not, they have not been largely successful with it accidentally. Politically it's been rather appealing, and only when it's really fallen apart have you seen any rejection of it. But as you write in your piece, and as you say here, you're not seeing any of the other 2008 candidates on the Bush side of things, save for Chuck Hagel, who has become more of an independent than anything, rejecting Bushism.
Well, and he's no one takes Chuck Hagel seriously as a contender in 2008.
Right. Although I'm hearing
for better
rumors
or
about him
worse.
in Unity 08, man. It's going to be a partnership for the ages.
Really?
Yeah.
Are you actually being serious
Mm-hmm.
about that? Because Unity 08, of course, actually continuing the self-promotional vein, the last issue of The Atlantic, my colleague Josh Green wrote a long piece about Unity 08 and their efforts to essentially create a bipartisan ticket for 2008. And actually, Chuck Hagel is one of the people for whom they're planning to have an internet primary and so on, and you have people register to vote online and register as delegates and so on. And it all, I tend to be skeptical of third parties in just about any form, but if you could get someone like Hagel to run, I know we're switching topics here.
Sure, I'd actually like to, because I can't overstate how much I loathe Unity 08. So let's go into this for a moment. Please continue.
Okay, so Unity 08. So switch
Unity
topics
08,
for a
for
moment.
those who don't know, is an organization convened by a sort of, a series of high to low level staffers of various presidential administrations, which takes as its reason for being the drafting of a sort of independent presidential ticket. A good example would be if you put McCain and Hagel on a ticket and ran them as an independent candidacy. I mean, they want to run pro, but what is amazing about them, its politics as meta. I mean, Unity 08 is literally about unity. They want somebody who comes from, either side, because they will say on their mission statement that nobody is correctly addressing the large problems facing the country, from, the energy crisis to healthcare to whatever. They have no preference, it appears to me, for how any of these problems are addressed. So they just want somebody who is addressing them to not have an R or a D after their name. It is an absolutely.
I think their plan is it couldn't be McCain Hagel. If a Republican gets the nomination, they have to pick a Democrat as their running mate. So it could be McCain Lieberman, which is obviously something that various people have floated in the past. It could be Hagel. Well, it wouldn't be Hagel Lieberman because they disagree so stridently on the war. But
what I'm saying is that would be okay for Unity 08. I mean, Hagel Lieberman, who believe on they're perfect inverses to each other. Hegel really has become truly anti-war, and Lieberman is almost fetishistically pro-war, and Lieberman isn't bad on things like the environment, and Hegel wants to turn all the trees into mulch. But it would be great for Unity 08 if Hegel and Lieberman would run together. I mean, they would adore it, because at base, all they want are two people who will run a unity ticket and unite America or do whatever it is. They have all this pretty sounding rhetoric about how the two parties aren't actually addressing any of the substantive and serious issues before us today, but they don't have any ideas for how they should be addressed. They're not saying nobody's addressing them. They're simply saying that they don't like political parties. I mean, it's the politics of personal statement. It's a politics of being above the muck. It isn't real, and I very genuinely feel that it's simply a way for a crew of people who aren't particularly identified with any of the serious candidates running now to feel really good about themselves and get into the media and get articles in The Atlantic about how they're trying to break us out of the two-party gridlock right now. I mean, you look at the 08 array of candidates. I mean, you have everybody from Giuliani, a pro-war, autocratic, socially liberal, somewhat authoritarian-leaning New York City mayor, to John Edwards, a pretty authentic populist, to Barack Obama, who is the most unifying candidate we've seen in decades, to Hillary Clinton, who's a sort of moderate liberal technocrat, to John McCain, to Sam Brownback. What solutions aren't being represented on this platform? You can't find them. What isn't here is unity.
Well, let me speak actually. I mean, usually 95% of the time I'm completely with you on the folly of sort of high-minded third-party efforts. But for the sake of argument, let me stick up for Unity 08 a little bit and just say, yes, clearly, there's something idiotic about saying you're starting a third party and saying you don't care what the ideas are as long as they're bipartisan. And it's the kind of fetishizing of bipartisanship that you get from, say, a David Broder column. However,
who wrote a very complimentary column about Unity 08.
Of course. No, it's designed to flatter the Broders of the world. But imagine for a moment that, I've been assuming that, if they end up with a nominee, they'll get someone sort of boring and centrist and technocratic, liberal on social issues and someone who claims he's a deficit hawk and so on. That would be boring. It is true, however, that if you could get someone like, Chuck Hagel, now it's true that, Chuck Hagel can run for the Republican nomination and he's going to be represented in some sense in the primaries and so on, but he's not, he's not going to get the Republican nomination. He's not going to be, in the end it's going to come down to a choice between Giuliani and Hillary or Obama and McCain or something like that. And Hagel does, in fact, represent an interesting strain in American political life, the socially conservative Midwestern quasi-isolationist / nationalist, partially for the reasons that I lay out in my article, is sort of getting shut out of the Republican Party a little bit, particularly on foreign policy matters. And it would be interesting to see someone like that in the race. And
I agree.
The one good thing that Unity 08 might do is precisely because they claim to have no ideology whatsoever, they might open the way for a somewhat interesting figure, because they can't object when if Hagel got the nod. Or
the existence of Chuck Hagel as a political figure on the scene may make Unity 08 accidentally do something worthwhile. But my point is exactly that. If there was a draft Chuck Hagel to be the independent candidate we've always wanted, or draft Al Gore, whoever you may want, I'd be all for that. I mean, I think what you're saying is exactly right. What I really dislike in American politics is the strain of fetishistic bipartisanship, broderism, whatever you want to call it. I feel like it's truly insulting to the real disagreements and the people truly trying to advance visions that better this nation, when you come at it from such a... I mean, when you look at them for their meta virtues and not their empirical virtues, I mean, when the question for what sort of healthcare system you should design is answered by saying, well, what is in the middle of Ted Kennedy and Sam Brownback? I mean, when you've got this sort of John Brew thing going on, he used to love to do this, to just like split the difference, give everybody what they wanted, go out. But he just liked compromising and getting things done. What Unity 08 likes is this idea that somewhere in the middle of the two extremes, and God knows where that is, or maybe it's not even in the middle, but it's simply rhetorically framed there, that there lies virtue, there lies truth, there lies the way forward. I mean, it reminds me of this great John Brew anecdote from David Broder's A Choice, and this is during the Clinton healthcare battle. And John Brew and I guess Broder, or possibly Broder's co-author Haynes, I think, are walking through the Louisiana airport. And this old woman comes up and she clutches Brew's arm and she says, Senator, don't you let the government get its hands on my Medicare. And Brew, not missing a beat, says, don't you worry, ma'am, I won't. I mean, that's what this is about in the end. I mean, it doesn't raise anything. It doesn't make
anything. You want the government to run Medicare all of a sudden? Next thing you're going to want the government to run the military.
Right, I know.
You're such a socialist, Ezra, my God.
Well, the rabbit hole goes deeper than that. But you're certainly right, I think, on the more specific element of Chuck Hagel. The true sadness in American politics, and I think this is true in 08, 08 is a more ideologically diverse field than we've seen in a while, but our spectrum is from here to here. I mean, it is very low compared to the choices offered in a European. I mean, I'm a liberal. I have to hold whatever Europe is doing as preeminent. But there you have Christian Democrats, which in many ways describes you, I think, better than what you have out here. Social Democrats, which it would be better for me. Liberals, third wayers like Blair. I mean, you really have a wider range of voices, which allows for a wider range of ideas and periodicals, and I think a much richer discussion. And what you have here, I mean, when you even try to open up a little bit, you get people like Unity 08, which really aren't attempting to do that. May do it by accident, but...
Right, no, they're trying to narrow the band even further.
Exactly.
No, I agree. On the other hand, personally, as a social conservative, while there's a sense in which I do admire the Christian Democrats of Europe, the fact is that social conservatism, and particularly the pro-life movement, has absolutely no traction in Europe.
Right.
And as obviously, I don't expect you to think that's a terrible loss to democracy over there. But from that perspective, I mean, there are things that American politics allows to flourish that Europe doesn't, and and both continents have a certain degree of consensus.
No. There's a middle. I mean, in the end, European, what you have in Europe, in Britain, say, is in fact the third way. I mean, the Clintonites have been in power for the last 12 or so years, but you're certainly right about that.
There's also,
I would just like to see more parties who are allowed into. I mean, you and me were political reporters.
No, I take your point, but there is also something to be said for for instance, take an issue like immigration, right? In a multi-party system like the French system, you have a party like the National Front, which is anti-immigrant and essentially in bed with racists, effectively, right? So there are virtues to the American system where, for instance, the Republican Party, sure, it includes some people who are opposed to immigration because they're racist, but its policy on immigration isn't controlled by the racist, and that means that people who are against immigration for much more reasonable reasons, you might say, have a voice without having to associate themselves with the crypto-fascists of the right.
But I mean, that could theoretically be true. I mean, we've done a lot of topic jumping around here, but that could theoretically be true in France as well, where you would have the National Front and also a party that was somewhat in favor of closing the borders off a bit or being a little bit more punitive towards illegal immigrants, and you could associate there. I'm not arguing that there aren't advantages to our system or that Europe is actually, in the way the political outcomes go, wider in debate. The political outcomes in Europe are much more to my liking, but they're not much more unpredictable, say, than they are in America. But I would like to see it's much harder for a guy like Chuck Hagel to get any traction in the national debate, I think, because he really doesn't have a movement he can step up and lead. I mean, much of American politics is very structural. He can go on Meet the Press, and that helps him out. But there isn't anybody who can sort of raise him up and put him on the ballot, which there would be in other places. And so far as Unity 08 may be able to do that, they may help us out. But it's a shame that the one sort of serious third-party entrant here is going to be, the one that wants to narrow the band, the one that is, entirely concerned with virtue and their own sort of above it all in politics, rather than, somebody actually coming forward and saying what we need in this country is a new isolationist whatever. I mean, assuming that Unity 08 retains
which isn't
control.
I mean, Hegel isn't really an isolationist, and I think actually people overstate his isolationism. He did vote for the invasion.
Well, I don't think he's an isolationist, but I would like
I would like to see an isolationist on the ballot from time to time as well. But let's talk about the ideological diversity that we do have for a minute, though. Because on the Republican side, the last 3 weeks have been Giuliani time, if it's okay to say that in spite of the associations with Amadou Diallo. So. For a long time, everybody was saying, well, Giuliani can't get the nomination. He's too socially liberal. He's too associated with New York liberalism in particular, and so on. And suddenly, partially because of the weakness of the GOP field, I think, and partially just because of the usual media hunger for a fresh face, people are talking, Giuliani's announced that he's running, and people are talking as if he's the front runner.
Right.
So I'm curious, what do you think of the Giuliani?
I don't see any as if about it. I think he is the front runner. I mean, you have a very weird Republican field in which both ends, both the Democrats and the Republicans seem to have three people who you could plausibly see getting the nomination, and maybe a fourth dark horse candidate. So on the left you have Hillary and Edwards and Obama and maybe Richardson, and on the right you have Giuliani and McCain and Romney and maybe Gingrich or something. I'm not really sure who you'd put there. What is fascinating is that to hear the media tell it, or to hear even, a lot of sort of bloggers or even conservatives tell it, every one of those people have a disqualifying flaw. Romney, he's a Mormon. The evangelicals, I'm told, will never vote for that. McCain, nobody trusts him. Nobody will vote for that. Giuliani, he loves the gays and loves the gun control. Nobody will ever vote for that. But they're going to have to vote for somebody. And you really don't have presidential contests where the people who come in, and particularly not on the right, where the guy who ends up winning is a guy who nobody ever thought could win when it began. I mean, it tends to be much more who's next in line than that. I tend to still think McCain will pull it out, But I've never understood why people think Giuliani will be disqualified. It's certainly true that he isn't completely in line. You know, as who was it, Kate O'Byrne wrote, he may not play in Peoria, but he can very easily, and he's very, I think, skillfully, simply say that, look, I may not agree, I may be pro-choice personally, but the only thing that matters to you is that I will appoint somebody like Sam Alito. This isn't well known, but in fact, the New Yorker reported a while back, and this has been backed up by Bauer, that in the 2000 campaign, McCain promised Bauer that he, what's the first name there?
Gary Bauer, yeah.
There you go. That he would appoint a pro-life Supreme Court judge. And Bush wouldn't make that promise. He wouldn't make the litmus test promise. That is why Bauer ended up endorsing McCain in the South Carolina primary. There's an element, and I don't know how this can be sold to primary voters, but there's an element where somebody like Giuliani, who will have to make a lot more concessions to the social conservatives in order to be elected, can't triangulate away from them in the way somebody like Newt Gingrich, who would seem to be more in their ideological mainstream, could. And if he makes the right promises from the beginning, he may be much less disqualified, particularly in a party worried it's going to lose power than we think.
It's possible. There are two caveats, though, that I would throw out. One is that it's different. Well, one is that Giuliani he may need, in order to get the Republican nomination, to explicitly say what McCain, as you said, apparently explicitly said secretly to Bauer, which is that I will have a litmus test and I will appoint judges who will overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, Giuliani hasn't said that yet. He's just said, I'll appoint judges in the mold of Alito, which is the same thing Bush did in 2000, saying, I'll appoint judges in the mold of Scalia. And the reason that, Giuliani is extremely reluctant to say, I'll appoint judges who overturn Roe is because while the American people are, if you look at polls, they're sort of operationally more pro-life than pro-choice in that they support many more restrictions on abortion than we have now. It's also the case that Roe versus Wade has this kind of talismanic quality, and it's like 60 to 65% of the country, or possibly even more, say they support Roe. Now they often don't know what Roe actually did, but they still, it's this talisman, which is why Bush was so reluctant to mention it. And it's possible, and I'm not sure that this is the case, but it's possible that Giuliani thinks, rightly, that he can't say, I'll appoint judges who will overturn Roe, because that would doom him in the general election. And if he can't say that, then he's left trying to send the same signals Bush did to the religious right without having the personal identification that Bush had. That's one caveat. The other quick caveat is that, Giuliani leads the Republican field right now, in fact, by a growing percentage. But the percentage of Republican voters who know anything about his positions on gay marriage and abortion is like 30 to 35%.
Right, it's very low.
So it is very soon to say for sure. And I say this as someone, I agree with you. I think Giuliani does have a path to the nomination, and I think that social conservatives generally are much more pragmatic.
Right.
A lot of people give them credit for. I
think this is a bigger deal than people realize. I think that particularly with social cons, in a way you don't see the media report on anybody on the left, there's a belief that they have an absolutely dogmatic, absolutely ideological test for every candidate they will support. And, I don't think any significant portion of the American electorate is actually like that. I think Giuliani, like McCain, like Romney, like Edwards, like Hillary, like Obama, like, Clinton, like Bush before them, will rise or fall based on whether he is able to project the correct mix of qualities and virtues and honesty and, compelling sort of attractiveness to the people who might vote for him. In the end, he's going to tell people enough that if they want to vote for Rudy Giuliani, they'll be able to make that case to themselves.
That's a good point.
You're going to have, he'll say, I'll appoint people like Alito. He'll say, I think abortion is a states' rights issue. He'll say on the gun issue, which I think is a perfectly valid formulation, that what you have to do in a city like New York is very different than what you want to do anywhere else in the world. And, the subtext of that is going to be very obvious to sort of people who the media thinks will desert him. That when you're dealing with marauding gangs of young black youth, you may need some gun control in a way you don't need in just in rural areas, in suburban areas. And I don't even, I think that that'll be perfectly fine. I think that there'll be plenty there if Giuliani ends up being an attractive candidate to these people for them to rationalize the vote for him. I do not think that, I just don't think the American electorate is particularly ideological. I think it's much more power interested, it's much more personal, it's much more into heuristics and qualities of the candidates and intuitive judgments, and I think that's how they all sort of end up in the end,
Well, I mean, speaking as a pro-lifer myself, I have done, I have no idea who I'll support in the primaries, but I've done some of that rationalization with Giuliani, particularly as Romney has come to look like a less attractive candidate. I have said to myself exactly what you just said, namely that, if you get Giuliani sort of committed to appointing certain kinds of judges, then in a sense you're on better ground than with someone like McCain, who's notionally pro-life, but, when push comes to shove, might feel fine just appointing sort of, not a David Souter, but an Anthony Kennedy or something.
Right.
That said, as a friend pointed out, the thing that, and this is obviously something that I don't think most voters think about it aside of, my sort of over-obsession with politics, but another point, though, is when it comes to Supreme Court nominations, who a president surrounds himself with matters a great deal.
Right.
And so it's true that, I don't think McCain would have any problem sort of sticking it to the religious right by appointing, a judge who would vote to uphold Roe. However, McCain is much more likely to have a White House that is staffed with pro-lifers, I think, than is Giuliani, whose inner circle tends to be New York conservatives who are, socially liberal people who want to bomb Iran.
There's also a question of intensity here, right? I mean, Giuliani, I get the feeling very strongly, doesn't care about these issues particularly. They are not what get him up in the morning, whether or not, there will be abortion in this country, whether or not there will be choice. I think that Giuliani really, 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 really wants to launch a series of catastrophic and devastating wars on other countries. And I don't think he will compromise that vision, even if the Republican Party wants him to. I do think he will be happy to compromise whatever social con vision he's got, or social liberal vision he's got. The place he's going to pick his fights, I think, just aren't there. I think Romney, to some degree, is similar, and I don't think McCain is, oddly enough. I mean, I think McCain is, as you say, notionally, I think he is notionally with the social cons, except that his overwhelming allegiance is to his sort of maverick reputation, to a vision of bringing the country together, and he will happily sacrifice, I think, these people who caused him so much trouble and smeared him so badly in order to, serve these sort of higher virtues that he sees himself and his role in politics as promoting. I don't think Giuliani and I don't think McCain have quite the same prioritization. I mean, and this is true on a lot of things, right? I did recently, and I don't mean to too much change the subject here, I did recently an interview with John Edwards on Iran. And he had gone to this conference in Israel, or teleconference into it, and said, under no circumstances can they have a nuclear weapon. None. All options on the table, they can't have it. And to people who, read, that means he will bomb Iran if they get a nuke. And so I got him alone, and I said, listen, is that really what you're saying here? Are you saying that if Iran is going to go nuclear tomorrow, you are going to send out the F-22s tonight? And he said, when I say all options on the table, I mean engagement first, and then when you actually think about what would happen if you bombed Iran, like everybody would rally around Ahmadinejad, and like they have plenty of ability to attack America both in Iraq and Oman, like the consequences would be horrible. So I don't think John Edwards is going to bomb Iran, partially because I think John Edwards believes it to be a bad idea, but partially because, generally speaking, I don't think John Edwards cares about bombing people. I don't think he gets up in the morning hoping that the transformative elements of his presidency will be a series of really spectacular wars, which, I think is a path to greatness that other presidents conceiving of these wars as good things and things they can win and successfully manage do. So I don't think John Edwards will compromise on the things that are really important to me, like healthcare. But I do, and I think he will compromise enough that he'll just drift through the Democratic mainstream on things like Iran and Iraq and, so forth. But I really think it's an important point where people compromise, where they seem to care.
Yeah, no, I'm actually happy to talk about Edwards. I think that his Iran rhetoric, the sort of all options on the table quasi-hawkishness, it's an example of, to be self-referential myself, of the argument I make in my Atlantic piece, namely that even after the Iraq War, the sort of the idea of hawkishness is still politically potent enough
Right.
that Democrats feel the need to rhetorically gesture towards, well, of course, if push comes to shove, I'm going to bomb Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's why Bush felt comfortable rejecting the Iraq Study Group report. It's why the Republican candidates aren't embracing realism and isolationism, and it has a spillover effect into the Democrats. But so here, since you've just, do you have a piece coming out?
I do. I have in a couple of weeks a long profile of them coming out in the
we
American
can't link to
Prospect
it yet,
magazine,
but we
your
can-
source for liberal intelligence.
Exactly. Well, so since you're, I guess you can be the resident expert on John Edwards. So I have been surprised, I guess, by the extent to which, one, the media is taking his candidacy very seriously, and two, the perception that he's doing very well. There was a story in the Times about a week ago, maybe more than that, sort of saying, oh, Edwards is running a very savvy campaign so far, and he's a realistic contender, and so on. And I agree that Edwards is a cut above the Vilsacs and the Richardsons and so on in the race for the Republican nomination. But I see him as having almost zero shot of getting the Democratic nod, and I'm curious, as someone who's definitely more pro-Edwards than I am, what do you see as the Edwards path to the nomination?
Well, I'm not pro anyone, I should say, but
of course not.
Okay.
For the sake of argument.
Sure, right. I would put Edwards in the 1.5 tier. If you're going to have a first tier, he's in it. If you're going to have a top tier, he may not be. I mean, and that's a sort of weird way of putting it, but it has seemed to me when you talk of the top tier, you talk of Obama and Clinton. When you talk of the first tier, you talk of Obama, Clinton, and Edwards. So he's there, but I mean, I wouldn't put his chances as higher than either of them. The Edwards path to the nomination, though, is very simple. The primary calendar was reshuffled to be the John Edwards path to the presidency primary calendar. It begins in Iowa, where he's ahead. He's been ahead in every poll. He doesn't lose his lead. Hillary gains or loses. He's got a very strong Iowa organization. The people love him. I traveled with him to Iowa, and I had a day in Des Moines, and I wandered around on the street chatting with people, told them why I was there. Who do they like? Everybody unanimously loved him. It wasn't at one of his events I'm talking here. They just liked the guy. He plays very well in Iowa. He is practically camped out there. Okay, let's say he wins in Iowa. The next caucus comes, a week later in Nevada. The Nevada caucus, I assume, will be dominated by Unite Here, the large hotel workers union that has unionized most of Vegas. And given that this caucus does not have any sort of traditional organization behind it, they'll have a lot of power. He was endorsed by them early in 2004. They love him. He has been critical in their Hotel Workers Rising campaign. He's really yoked himself to organized labor. You could really see him taking Nevada, too. New Hampshire, I don't see him taking. I don't see how he does it. I see Obama, but I'm not sure who does. I don't know if it's Hillary. I don't know if it's Obama. South Carolina, Edwards' hometown. He won it in 2004. You begin to see how the primary schedule can make him, can catapult him forward. Now, this all looked much more sure. When it was him and Hillary, I would have said he'll win. That he is such a, he seems so legitimate. And people are going to be so quick to abandon Hillary if she shows.
See, I guess I'm crazy. I watch Edwards on TV, and he seems like a very poor man to Bill Clinton. But everybody responds to him differently, I guess.
I think that and this will be the argument of my piece, so I want to keep a little bit of my powder dry here. But Edwards is going to be the one bringing back the old-time religion. He's not. He was sort of a poor man's Bill Clinton in 2004.
Right.
In 2008. He'll be sort of a modern man's William Jennings Bryan. And the real question is how much appeal that's going to have. Populism is a tough appeal to make, but Edwards, in a way that neither the messages, that really, certainly the message of Hillary doesn't have, and I'm a little bit skeptical that unless Obama changes, his does either, in an electorate that is somewhat a Democratic electorate that is angry, that is combative, that is sort of unshackled, I think that his sort of ferocious populism, his ability to point out enemies and sort of publicly vivisect them, his ability to be sort of a forthright champion for things like strong universal health care, for things like more social investment before you get into reducing the deficit, things that Democrats traditionally want, and that he's going to be able to credibly propose in the sense that only, people like Tom Harkin, who aren't particularly credible candidates, have in recent years. He has the possibility, the potential to ignite the Democratic electorate. I'm sorry, I need to take a drink of water here.
No problem. I've been taking drinks of water throughout.
But I think he's good, too. I mean, and one thing I think people forget is that the guy can give a really good speech. Hillary can't. She's got her own other, strengths in the field. Obama, God knows, can. But Obama and Edwards are inverse rhetoricians to each other. Obama, his rhetoric operates somewhere in orbit. I mean, he never sinks down to the tawdry level of politics. He goes meta from the beginning, critiques sort of the political theater of it all, and then talks about unity or cynicism or apathy or hope or whatever it may be. Edwards comes out and talks about 8-year-old girls who can't buy jackets and, young families without health insurance and this and that. And his relentless focus on sort of the individual cost of the American economy is, I think, a powerful thing. He answers in a way Obama doesn't, the question of who do we being Democrats here, stand for, who are our enemies, and what do we want to do. And at some point Obama's going to have to come out with his answers there too, and maybe they'll be good ones, but I think that Obama may end up being so trapped by his own gigantic popularity. When you have 85% approval, do you really want to go down to 54? That his answers, when they come, may be really ripe for attack. And Edwards may prove to be able to sort of, create this rhetorical frame where on the one hand there's your general, sort of mealy-mouthed, ready to compromise Democratic frontrunners, and then there's him, and he's really ready to go out and fight. And that may have appeal.
Yeah, I guess I mean, partially I'm biased because I find Obama so much more appealing than Edwards, and when I look at them sort of splitting up an anti-Hillary vote, I have a hard time seeing Edwards losing out to Obama. And I agree with you that Edwards was in much better shape, before Obama got in, because as the alternative to Hillary, he obviously has a lot of appeal, and he can give a speech and woo a crowd in a way Hillary's never been able to. Mm-hmm. My own pet theory about this, though, and I'm curious to know what you think of it because you've done reporting on this as well, is that in a field where it looked like John Edwards was becoming a plausible, Democratic nominee for president of the United States, I think that Al Gore would be crazy not to get into the race, because it would mean that the nomination would be his for the taking.
Well, right, Hillary Edwards formulation, I would think he'd come in too.
You do?
I don't know what happens if Obama's in there. I don't know if he'll come in. I mean, I did a profile of Gore before an Inconvenient Truth came out. Something like that. And I'm very impressed with the guy. The question is, can he bear losing, right? You're Al Gore. The last year and a half have been a restoration, a public comeback of immense proportions. Just truly a spectacular thing for him, right? After 2000, he was weak and he was, boring, and now he's electric and may win an Oscar and this and that. Does he want to possibly lose the Democratic nomination for president? Does he want to possibly give up the aura of sort of comeback kid, conscience of the party, for possibly becoming the once again a political failure?
Right, Gary Hart in '88.
Right.
Yeah, whoever. Not Gary Hart with.
I have to think it's hard to pull the trigger when that is even the likeliest outcome, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why, but that's why I see the sort of the Edwards moment as being the moment when he feels when the pressure to pull the trigger becomes so great. Just because what Edwards represents is, essentially, like particularly on, for instance, on foreign policy, it's just, Edwards has done a masterful job of becoming the anti-war candidate, despite of having voted for the Iraq War initially. But that's on that issue, Al Gore can just blow John Edwards out of the water.
And all of them. I mean, Al Gore is, I think, a much stronger candidate than Hillary Clinton, John Edwards, or Barack Obama.
Yeah, no, I can see that. The one thing, I did see a poll the other day suggesting that in spite of his comeback, that Gore's favorable ratings were still relatively low,
Yeah, they
like
are.
in the 40s,
They are
39 or something, which suggests that but certainly I think that within Democratic ranks, his comeback has been huge.
And particularly within the ranks of sort of early liberal influencers, the
Right.
sort of people, the concentric circle folks, or the Dean voters, or the people who, over a period of 6 or 8 months, swing others and donate the money. I mean,
Right.
he has a reservoir. I just see this on my blog. He has a reservoir of goodwill that is unlike anybody else in the party. I've never seen anything like it. I don't even totally understand it. But, and I'd like to hear you on this, Ross, because, I'm very much in this milieu, and it's a little bit hard for me to step out. If you saw Clinton and Edwards and Barack and Gore on a podium, wouldn't the others look light in comparison? I mean, I think both Obama and Edwards suffer from this, to a pretty severe degree. Obama is better at hiding it because his voice carries so much authority in it, and
Right.
Edwards is able to hide it to some degree by being sort of electric. And Hillary, I think, is able to hide it because it isn't true for her. She's actually been around these decisions, but
Right.
Gore has a gravitas you don't see currently in the Democratic primary. A level of experience has actually helped command armed forces. Has actually been at war, which has actually been in the military, which is not true, by the way. I just realized for any of the other Democratic frontrunners. It is.
No, that's all true. I mean, my one question would be whether Gore is still a little bit weird. And I know everybody said, in An Inconvenient Truth, he was so loose and so funny, and where was this Al Gore in 2000 and so on. And, I watched Inconvenient Truth. It was really well done. And he clearly was looser and funnier and more relaxed than he was in the 2000 race. That said, Al Gore is, he's never been and he's never going to be a natural politician.
Right.
In the way that I think both Obama and Edwards are. Now, it's true, absolutely what you say, and this is why I think Gore should run, is that you put him on a podium with those guys, he has more gravitas, he has more experience. The contrast between his record and particularly Obama and Edwards is just, it's shocking, frankly. Edwards is a one-term senator from North Carolina, and Obama has been a senator for 2 years, and Al Gore was vice president of the United States for 8 years. So that's a huge disparity, and it is a weird situation where Hillary can match his experience in a sense, but she doesn't have enough sort of political skill in a way, I think, to use that advantage.
I think you can.
But all that said, he is still a little weird.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that, by the way. I think that, and there's a real question, if Gore ran again, does he turn back into a pumpkin? Does he turn back into Al Gore circa 2000? Although, I think Al Gore circa 2000 has become exaggerated in how weird he was because, post-election,
Saturday Night Live and so on.
He actually did win that, what was it, 49.8% of the country voted for him. And
he did, yeah.
So I think that can be exaggerated a bit in retrospect.
Right. He's not Bob Dole. I agree. He can win a national election.
Right.
He's demonstrated that.
But I think in the end there's a question of whether or not the sort of things that made him unsuited in many ways for the 2000 moment. He was a very serious, very thoughtful, very sort of cautious, very experience-heavy guy in what was essentially a pretty frivolous election where the issues at hand were how do we spend our gigantic surplus of money? And what do we,
Lockbox.
Who is going to, how much sex can you have in the Oval Office and where can you have it and with whom can you have it? And I don't know that he was well cut out for that. I think he is well cut out for being the guy the Democratic Party can imagine bringing troops home. I think that's a harder thing to imagine with Edwards or Obama. I don't think it's hard to imagine with Hillary, her commanding the armed forces. I do think it is something a lot of Democrats don't want to imagine because fundamentally I don't think she agrees with a lot of them. Gore, I think, both agrees and seems like the sort of guy who could be taken seriously in that form. And I think that he, the things that even at times made him problematic in 2000 could actually be powers of his in 2008, that he's a much better suited candidate for this moment than he was for that moment. But again, I mean that what you're going to see is coming up. In May, Al Gore is releasing another book, and the book is, very explicitly political. As I remember it, and I haven't seen anything new on it in a couple months, it's about reason in American politics and what has happened to our discourse, and, it's going to be very
Oh, boy, I can't wait.
Right, I know.
Sorry. No, go on.
I got to say, Edwards just brought out a book, or is about to bring out a book of edited academic articles on ending poverty. I mean, he is the first presidential candidate who, if he loses, he should begin editing American Prospect special reports. So,
well, he'll be looking for something to do. So
right. So Gore's going to bring out this book, and the question will be: this will be in 4 or 5 months yet, and how bored by then is the media with Obama, Clinton, and to some degree Edwards? As Karl Rove said the other day, it's beginning so early. There's going to be an inevitable backlash, or he believes, and I don't think he's wrong. I think people are going to get bored of this. Right. People will look for new faces. I mean, even though there are a lot of new faces already, and if this book gets Gore the sort of attention Inconvenient Truth did, if he goes out and his rallies attract 8,000 people at the New York Barnes & Nobles, if he, this is a testing the waters book. It's coming at exactly the right moment. It allows him to begin touring the nation during the heat of the presidential primary, and it allows him at the end of it to get in to say, what I saw in my travels here was that people really do need a different type of leadership, whatever.
Right.
But that is when you're going to see him come back into the public eye, and you're going to see how the public will actually react to him, because given the sort of the 2008 tease that will be, the media is going to really give him a chance to check it out.
Yeah, well, that'll be very interesting. So he's not going to announce he's running for president when he accepts Best Documentary Oscar in 2 weeks.
That'd be something, though, wouldn't it? If
that would be something. Well, you're never going to get a bigger audience, but
right. I'd like to think.
But yeah, he probably doesn't want to run as the Hollywood candidate.
Right.
So.
No, you can't do that.
Well, why don't we finish up on a slightly lighter note, since we've been talking about John Edwards, and since I have you here, you are an alumnus of the blog Pandagon, right? Which is the blog of Amanda Marcotte, who was not fired, but resigned as a campaign blogger for John Edwards after being attacked for her, some said anti-Catholic, some said perfectly reasonable attacks on religious conservatives and so on. So I guess I'm curious. I think you've done a couple blog posts, sort of, if not defending her, then at least saying that they should have kept her on and so forth. So I'm curious about what's the defense of Amanda Marcotte as effectively an internet spokesman for the Edwards campaign.
Okay. Amanda Marcotte, who's a great friend of mine.
Sorry for mispronouncing.
I may be as well. Amanda is a great friend of mine. I think she is a brilliant writer. I think her prose is graceful and elegant. I think she's interesting. I think she does that widening of the discourse that I'm talking about is needed out there. She's one of about 5 or 6 people who, if you really wanted to screw over your campaign, you would hire them to be your web spokespeople. I mean, it was a screw-up of magnificent proportions. I don't know what they did. I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, it clearly got fouled up at many points in the sort of vetting, hiring, proposing, finishing process right there. And then they let her keep her own blog. I mean, on every level, what it showed among the campaign, which was, I think, worrying, given that they had a lot of good press right then because he gave a good DNC speech, was a fundamental incompetence. They did a terrible job. That said, I did defend her. I assumed, and to some degree, this, you could either assume they're incompetent or unprepared, but only one of the two, that they knew who they had hired. And that once they had hired her, once she had moved to North Carolina for them, they had to stand by her, too. And that you couldn't... I don't agree with a lot of what Amanda writes. I think it's fine. I don't think she should work on a campaign. I don't think that is where her sort of comparative advantage is.
Right.
But I don't think what she writes is, she's essentially she's a satirical attacker. I mean, she's a polemicist in the way that somebody like James Wolcott is. They don't mean every image and every analogy and every metaphor and every attack. It's not all meant to be taken quite so literally. But It also isn't all meant to be brought into a campaign. She's my friend. I believe that she should have been kept on. I think she actually did resign of her own power at a certain point. I wouldn't have wanted to stay in that job either. It would have been sort of tough. the fault there lay with the campaign. She, perfectly soundly, either applied for or was asked to apply for this job, assumed that they knew what she did for, had been doing in a public forum with 15,000 readers a day for years now. And when they said they loved it and you should come on down, came on down. The fault was with them, who hired somebody they shouldn't have hired, and then took a day or two dithering, and then didn't hit back against people who I really think are vicious sort of distorters of the public discourse, like Donahue, and then eventually let her keep her own blog. I mean, on every level, there was real confidence on the part of the campaign. Amanda, she's not right for this job. Well, she should be she's a great essayist and should do that. I mean, she should be where she can speak about the things that she wants to speak about. The John Edwards for President campaign blog is not that spot. But I do think
that's a very, very nuanced and fair-minded take, I have to say. I mean, my impression, as a Catholic, I understand what the internet's like. I'm not particularly offended when somebody, makes blasphemous jokes about the Virgin Mary. I think it's kind of stupid. I can't say that I share your assessment of her great writing gifts, but I obviously there's the internet is what it is, blogging is what it is, and and clearly she is I'm not sure I'd compare her to James Wolcott just because of the level of profanity and so on.
Sure, I mean
I would say, and if you want to give her, maybe this isn't giving her enough credit as a thinker, but there is something more on the level of a Michael Savage and so on, where it's like sort of deliberate provocations pitched to a specific audience and so on, and that's and that's fine. I mean,
okay.
Obviously, right? No, I don't expect you to agree that she's on the same level as Savage and so on, but I mean, it wasn't just the thing she said about Catholics. Like, clearly she has deep and abiding antipathy towards sort of the culture of Republican America, and she expresses that in often profane ways that are. It's
every post she's ever written. It's not just the hot white spirit of the.
No, absolutely. I think that was blown out of proportion because it enabled Donahue to cry anti-Catholic bigotry, and she's not an anti-Catholic bigot. She's an anti, whatever you want to say. She's someone who's deeply hostile to the culture of red America, broadly understood.
Right, and that's allowed.
There's a place for that on the internet, and whatever she wants to say, more power to her. But I agree with you. It's a reflection of sort of the way that there is this deep generational disconnect with the internet, and it manifests itself in, I think, hiring decisions all the time, where people get hired. You saw this with Ben Dominick, who was hired as a blogger for the Washington Post, and eventually he lost a job because it turned out he'd plagiarized. But before that, he was attacked, by people on the left for other things he'd written and so on. And there's a sense in you could tell the Post had not done due diligence on who Ben Dominick was, in the same way that the Edwards campaign. It strikes you and I as weird, and maybe it is just a generation gap. Like, people don't understand that you need to go read the bloggers' archives before you hire them.
Yeah, I mean, it was an ugly thing to watch, and it was sad because, look, we agree on what she does. She's a very spirited assailant of red state culture. And she's very good at it, and I think there is space in the public discourse for people who do that. I mean, it isn't what I do, but I think that
I think we need more profanity in our healthcare policy posts. That's
God knows we need more of something in them, so that we're a bit more readable. And I think them written by Amanda Marcotte would really be fascinating. But she's an essayist. I mean, there's an audience for what she does. I think that for people like Amanda, who have lived or grew up in sort of conservative readouts and really felt that their outlook on life has been marginalized, that she speaks to a real sort of yearning there, and that is, I think, an admirable, or if not, I think an admirable, you may not. It's not who you hire for the campaign. I mean, the whole issue of this is not, in fact, Amanda. It is a campaign. Amanda was never a spokesperson for anybody but Amanda. The day they hired her.
However, she did, to be fair, she did take the job she did, decide to.
Right, but she
did, at some point, think of herself as an appropriate. I mean, you can't imagine, for instance, if I called up George Carlin and said, "Hey, George, come be my, spokesman for my presidential campaign." George Carlin would say no. I mean, clearly, Amanda, and this maybe to her credit, thought of herself as someone who could potentially do this job and act as a spokesman.
Well, weirdly, I think that what Amanda thought and what a lot of bloggers thought, and I don't think the Edwards campaign realized, was that everybody took her hiring, and I'm not sure about this. I think they reached out to her. Everybody took her hiring as evidence that the Edwards campaign was going to pick those enemies. That, Amanda knew who Amanda was, right? So when she was given that job, she thought they knew who Amanda was and would want a spokesperson, possibly, who
was going right. Edwards would be the candidate who was against the religious right, against sort of militarism in Red America.
Maybe not in the
like
way
that.
Amanda is, but
that would be something to see. But yeah.
Even Kucinich won't curse, but maybe not in the way Amanda is, but that her hiring was something of a statement. And if they wanted her, she agreed with the campaign on many things and thought it was a good campaign, and she should come. I don't blame her. I blame her for having written that Children of Ben post. That was a dumb idea. But she wrote...
Well, I actually thought that was perfectly harmless. But that was a case
but
where
she just shouldn't.
You're damned for your previous activities.
Right. She should have known better, after the week that Donahue attacked her, than to go and talk about, sort of patriarchal implications of the Virgin Mary. But be that as it may, when she was hired, Amanda is, in her 20s, I think, wanted a job on a campaign, wanted a job on this campaign, was happy to have it, assumed they knew who she was. She, I don't see anything wrong with her taking them at their word. What I saw to be wrong was them either having been too incompetent to read the public archives of the high-profile writer they've hired, or to have not been able to predict an entirely predictable response and then flip on it and sort of screw her over. Again, in the end, for me, the fault here lay with the campaign, not with her. And by the way, Melissa McEwen, Shakespeare's sister, who is often or used to be a weekend writer at my site, she got dragged into all of this simply by association. She's a wonderful writer who would have been great for the campaign. Amanda, too, is a wonderful writer. I just don't think would have been good for the campaign. But she really got a raw deal out of it, and it's truly a shame. And by the way, somebody should say that the most loathsome character in all this is not the girl who lives in Texas and runs a free blog for people. It's the culture warrior who has made a living and created an organization devoted to nothing but sort of amassing power and running people he doesn't like out of politics. I think Donahue and people like him, and if there are people on the left, them as well, is Bill Donahue is an unpleasant character. There are about 500 Bill Donahues in American politics representing different constituencies, all of them waiting to jump on things like this. Right.
And,
that's why you can't hire people like Amanda, but
Well, yeah, and maybe that's too bad. Well, anyway, why don't we end on the note of comedy that we agree that the Edwards campaign made a mistake in hiring her, and with that bit of bipartisanship, it's been great talking to you.
And you, Russ, always a pleasure.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.